Welcome to the second session of this symposium on the child's right to identity in emergency settings. Just a bit of housekeeping before we start the presentations. There is for those who are just joining now that are new, there is interpretation. You'll see the interpretation button at the bottom of your screens. It is in French, English, Spanish, and it says German, but German is Arabic. To benefit from the privilege of having such exclusive and high caliber presenters today, we have chosen to focus on their presentations, which means that the bios will be put in the chat function. It also means that we won't have a public question and answer time. I see that there are questions in the question and answer function. We will respond to those that we can during the meeting, but if not, we will give due consideration and try to respond to those after the meeting. Also that you know that there have been a significant number of people that have registered for this event today, and given the interest, we hope that this is only the beginning of meetings that we will have on these topics. And without further ado, I'd like to hand over to the moderator of the day, Denisha Moss from the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. Thanks, Denisha.
Thank you, Mia. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Denisha Moss, and I lead the children's program at the Institute on Statelessness and Inclusion. And I am pleased to moderate today's second session on children's identity rights in emergencies, focusing specifically on the context of armed conflict. The right to identity, including nationality, is protected under the Convention on the Rights of the Child and forms an integral part of ensuring that children are able to enjoy other rights guaranteed under the convention. So where identity and nationality are compromised, children face an undeniable risk of some of the most heinous violations, including the 6th grade violations committed against children in armed conflict. I am joined today by an esteemed panel of 5 speakers, all from different backgrounds, who will focus on the importance of protecting children's identity rights, specifically in the context of armed conflict. So without further ado, I would like to introduce our first speaker, Ms. Jajitsa Nagavitsa, who represents the Office of the Special Representative of the Secretary General on Children Affected by Armed Conflict, and she will be speaking about the 6th grade violations children affected by armed conflict face, how those risks are exacerbated for children lacking identity documents and nationality, and how the mandate is addressing these concerns. And so I would like to hand over to you, Jajitsa.
Thank you so much, Denisha, and thanks to ISI and Child Identity Protection for inviting me to represent my office at this symposium. A special thanks to you for bringing in children's voices. I, as a child who grew up in war in Bosnia, these drawings were really resonant and really poignant. So thank you for that. Like you alluded in your introduction to me, our mandate of the Office of the Special Representative to the Secretary General for Children in Armed Conflict, it's a mouthful, derives from the UN General Assembly and 13 Security Council resolutions that has existed for 25 years now and is framed around monitoring and reporting around these 6th grade violations. And they include recruitment and use of children, killing and maiming, rape and other forms of sexual violence, abduction, attacks on schools and hospitals, and the denial of humanitarian access. And just for 2021 period, as reported in the Secretary General's annual report we published in July this year, we verified almost 24,000 violations across these 6. And cross-referencing the list of countries in preparation for this that have existing gender discrimination, for instance, the nationality laws, which prevents women from equally conferring nationality to their children, mentioned by previous speakers in the first panel, against the 25 situations that we cover right now. There are 6 overlapping on our agenda, and these are Lebanon, Somalia, Iraq, Libya, Sudan, Syria, and Nepal used to be on our agenda. So it was an interesting bit of research on my part. But we know that in conflict contexts, families may be separated, as we've heard, civil documents lost and family members killed, maybe killed or detained. Displaced children may be unable to provide a legal link to their father and therefore unable to acquire their father's nationality. When women are denied their equal right to pass nationality, children who are in or displaced from conflict contexts are at even greater risk of statelessness. And when the state maintains discretion regarding the conferral of nationality to children of female citizens, this is one of the points that resonated with me from previous colleagues speaking in session 1. The state may reject nationality applications due to child's assumed link to certain ethnic or religious racial groups, including communities that are linked to armed groups. So what I thought would be interesting today would be to just look through the lens of these 6 grave violations and how it relates to children's identity and the issue of statelessness. Really, the statelessness and discriminatory nationality laws compound children's vulnerabilities and increase their exposure to these violations. So just to give you a few examples, starting with the recruitment and use of children for military purposes, those children that are stateless or without identity documents or birth registration to prove that they are below 18 years of age are more easily recruited into armed groups and armed forces. And once released from these groups, often through dialogue with parties to conflict from the UN side, they lack identification that would further complicate their access to reintegration and rehabilitation services that they so rightfully need and deserve, which then also subjects them to the risk of re-recruitment. And recruitment and use continues to be one of the highest of these violations that we monitor year in and year out. Looking at stateless children's inability to move within or outside of country due to their lack of identity documents, they may be trapped in active areas of conflict, so exposed to risk of shelling and discriminate attacks, and therefore killing and maiming, also one of our highest verified violations. And then when we're looking at the impact, obviously, with regards to exposure of women and girls who lack legal identity to sexual and gender-based violence, crimes, and trafficking, this is another manifestation for us of how statelessness increases those vulnerabilities. And then one final point, in thinking through the lens of the grave violations in the course of emerging counterterrorism efforts, for us, we see that women and children, and this was also mentioned earlier, with links to UN designated terrorist groups may be rendered stateless, with countries that are increasingly resorting to stripping their citizenship of those who are affiliated or alleged to be affiliated with terrorist groups, which makes them vulnerable to other violations of their human rights. And our mandate focuses on ending these violations, but monitoring prevention of violations and provision of these reintegration services that I mentioned for conflict-affected children is virtually impossible without a child's recorded identity. So the impact is tremendous, not least to say at the cost of our joint vision for achieving the SDGs by 2030. I'll leave it at that. Thank you so much. Back to you, Denisha.
Thank you so much, Jalatica, for expounding on how children without identity documents and stateless children are at an increased risk of suffering these grave violations, especially recruitment and the denial of humanitarian assistance, and even re-recruitment, which are amongst the most grave violations that your office is seeking to prevent. I would now like to invite our second and third speakers for this session, who will be co-presenting on their experiences in the context of the Colombian conflict. Mr. Furley Vargas, who will share his story of successful reintegration into society following his experience as a child soldier. And his presentation will be immediately followed by Ms. Stella Duke, who is the executive director of an organization called Tala de Vida. And her organization facilitates rehabilitation and reintegration of those affected by armed conflict through youth activism and art. Over to you, Furley. And can you both please make sure that you have your language switched to Spanish at the bottom of the screen? Thank you.
No sé si me están escuchando a mí y puedo continuar mientras Ferley resuelve el problema del audio. ¿Está bien?
I am going to continue while Ferley solves his technical issue with his audio channel.
Perfect. Thank you, Stella.
Muy bien. Me gustaría contarles que somos el centro
Thank you
de
very much. I would like to tell you that we are the Center for Psychosocial Support. For 30 years, we have been working
marco del conflicto armado que hemos vivido como país por más de
in the
60
context of the conflict that we have been living in the country. Human rights have been violated for kids, for children, for boys and girls. They have no identity and they are recruited by illegal armed groups in Colombia. And some of them are becoming child soldiers. And some of our main objectives is to work on this context. So there I met Ferley. He was part of our process. And I would like to mention that this is a situation of great vulnerability in terms of children. On the one hand, there is no identity. There is a complete lack of attachment towards the family, but also there is no participation from civil society. This is what we have been experiencing and children have been experiencing in the context of the armed conflict in Colombia. We have had some peace agreements in the country a few years ago, but we are still in the process of peace building. We are trying to negotiate still with some guerrilla groups and rebel groups. The government and the FARC guerrillas reached an agreement, as I was saying, and nowadays the government just started yesterday a new negotiation for a peace agreement with the ELN, another rebel group. But besides it, we have a gangsterism aligned with narco trafficking, with drug trafficking. So this is also affecting indigenous people, indigenous children, children who have no identity and they are victims of the armed conflict. So this means that they don't exist as human beings, as a person registered, and they are used as objects. Sometimes they can escape or they are recovered through some agreement. We have to start through an inclusion process towards a civil life after receiving violence, aggressions, forced labor, extreme stress, fear, and many different situations. So in terms of civil society, we have to focus on the restitution of rights, starting with the strengthening of the civil society. This is not understood exactly. How does it exist? How is it articulated? How can we collaborate or contribute to the process? In many cases, we want to start the process of education because many of them are illiterate. They never had access to schooling. They have never seen a pencil, a notebook. They didn't have the chance to holding anything besides a weapon. Also, health is a risk. Illnesses such as leishmaniasis and other illnesses that they are exposed to in the jungle. So reintegration implies different entities. For example, the Colombian Institute for Family Well-being and civil society organizations, such as ours, in alliance with international organizations such as the United Nations, and they have to insist to the Colombian government that they have to listen to us. They have to work on the integration of boys and girls who have been victims of the armed conflict. So this is a long process, really complex, and we need to create awareness in the civil society so that they understand how difficult it is. It is very easy to take a kid to war, but it's not easy to take the war out of the kid, especially when this kid is trying to come back to civil society, and this implies justice. We need to talk about justice in all its different aspects. Also, they need to be legal human beings with a nationality as part of a country, and they have to understand this. And lastly, we want to work on education, as I was saying, and training. This is, again, a process that involves psychosocial support. This is what we do, especially. And we give voice to boys and girls from strategies that are linked to art therapy and processes from a systemic approach. We use methodologies such as photo voice, digital narratives, art expressions as well, movement, physical movement, and we want them to understand through these tools how they can be participants in this new context of a new society. We need to achieve that boys and girls are coming out of the armed conflict. This is a challenge for us. Thank you very much. Ferley is now with us. I hope that he can share his experience with us. Shane, thank you.
Hola, Ferley, te seguimos sin escuchar, no sé qué pasó.
We don't. Ferley, we don't have audio at the moment for you. Okay, I think maybe Ferley will rejoin the panel, but perhaps we should move
Sí,
on.
Ferley está en el sur de Colombia, en una zona bastante apartada.
He is currently in a remote area called El Caquetá in southern Colombia. And we've experienced a very intense winter rainy season, so that might be the reason for his connectivity issues. Now we can hear you, Ferley.
Yes, we can hear you now. Wonderful.
Good morning. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to share my experience. I hope that this can be useful. I'm trying to summarize my life since I was a kid. When I was 5 years old, my father was murdered in the dining room in the house where we were living. My mother in that moment had to, well, support us, the family, to guide us through life. Then there was another event in my life when I was 14 years old, and in that moment, the Colombian army held a military operation, and they kidnapped, or they detained, let's say, 23 people, including my mother. This was really complex for us, of course, so we became immediately orphans. My mom was, well, in prison. So we had to, well, my younger brother and I had to deal with our own lives. So at the end of this year, I decided to join the FARC armed group. This decision was based on the fact that I wanted to take revenge of what had happened. I joined FARC from the 14th until I was 17 years old, and in this moment, I realized that the group that I was part of had murdered my father. So then I joined the paramilitary forces, right-wing militias in Colombia. And paramilitaries, as we call them, I was paid 1.5 million pesos in Colombia, which is around $400. And some years later, I was handed to the government and I was part of the reintegration process. And this employer or this official said, "Welcome to civilian life." We escaped from the paramilitary group. We were detained, and I was 15 days detained. And every day we were being threatened. They said that they were going to kill us. But at some point, as I was saying before, we joined the official process to reintegrate into civil society. But of course, I had no idea how to behave in a city. I only owned what I was wearing, and I had no knowledge besides what I had learned at war. I did my primary school in rural areas in Colombia. In those years, education was quite basic, so I barely knew how to read or write. So I was almost in a condition of illiteracy. So I was taken out of the bush and landed in a massive city such as Bogota, the capital of Colombia. And the success of my process is linked to a sequence of events. The family attachment is quite important. I see that for many of my partners are rejected by their family members because they were part of armed groups. I have met great people that are able to receive us with their hearts, such as Estela Duque. So I want to thank her right now. Through her organization, we felt like in a family. And we needed that coming out of the armed conflict. And I think that society is stigmatizing. Well, so we are victims of this because we were part of the armed conflict, but people are never asking, why did we become part of an armed group? So we are seeing doors that are closed constantly in front of us. So that's why many of us end up going back to the war. So this is a situation that it's really affecting us in a really bad way. Now I have been working for 10 years as a filmmaker. I have worked in TV with many different channels, and I was able to film the peace agreement, and I even filmed my colleagues who were part of the armed group when I was part of FARC as well. Also, some of them who went back to the war, and this is because they were not able to find other opportunities to live in a good and positive way, contributing to society. So I just want to say, to close this statement, that it's important to consider the butterfly effect. Let's say, nowadays we have a particular historical moment, but it might feel that it's very small, it has no significance, no transcendence. But see, years later, it becomes important. When I was 5 years old, my dad was murdered. Later on, years later, I decided to look for revenge, to become part of the armed group. And after this, I met great people who welcomed me, and now I am giving this back to society. This is why nowadays I have an audiovisual project, a filmmaking project that is developing my capacities. I was able to achieve or to get a university degree. I have a profession, I have a job, and I try to use this for the benefit of my family and the community that I belong to. So that's the reflection. This should be a process that seeks for a solution in a month, just taking people out of the bush and into the city. This is a long-term process. Some friends of mine are lawyers right now or doctors, and they were once part of armed groups. I also have friends who came out of the bush and then went back to the rebel groups and they ended up murdered. A friend of mine was hired to be a hitman in 2012. He was murdered eventually and he was buried in our village. The other person who escaped with me, he was part of the paramilitary groups. He killed someone and then he was arrested and he was in prison for 8 years. Now he's back as part of society. So what I wanted to say is that reintegration is a long-term process. Thank you, Ferley. Indeed, this is a challenge. Reintegration processes need the participation of the state, of the government, and they have to follow the whole process for this long term. Otherwise, people are not going to be able to be part of civil society. A lot of harm has been done to these people. So it is a collective effort and a participatory effort that needs to work with them. Also, a social tissue supporting these people coming into society. Thank you so much for listening to us.
Thank you so much, Ferley, for sharing your story in this space. It really was incredible to hear, and yours is really a success story. And I think it's just really brave of you to come and share that. And I also want to say for people who are watching, Frole had shared with
La historia
us.
de Ferley es muy conmovedora para quienes han estado.
Frole had shared with us.
Ferley ha compartido con nosotros
that he made about his life. And so we will try to find that and share that also in the chat for those who are interested in following. And Stella, also for you, thank you so much for sharing. And I think just hats off to your organization for all the work that it's doing with respect to rehabilitation of children affected by armed conflict and promoting their inclusion in society. I want to now just move on in the interest of time to our fourth speaker, who is Ms. Rizan Sheikh Dallair, and she supports a tremendous civil society effort in Iraq. The campaign is entitled My Name is My Mother's, and it brings together activists and organizations, parliamentarians, and others who are advocating for legal identity rights of children born in Iraq who are denied registration under their mother's names and consequently denied identity documents because their fathers, who are associated with ISIS, are missing or unknown or deceased. Rizan, I'd like to turn the floor over to you.
مساء الخير. طبعا شكرا إلى
Good evening. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dinisha. Thank you, Dinisha. I'm Rezan from Iraq. From previous parliamentarian rounds. This the campaign that we are carrying is in Iraq. It is unfortunate that after 2014, all the information after the attack of ISIS, unfortunately, all the some of the provinces were fell under the control of ISIS. Anbar, Al-Mosul, and all these areas are very important areas, as they have a number of Yazidis, who is a certain non-Muslim tribes. Unfortunately, in our campaign, we are carrying out our activities to support the right of children and the role of civil society and the role of UN and all the national organizations to support all these children. These children are undergoing very difficult situation. These children are born by mothers, Yazidi mothers, and they are not Muslims, and they are Iraqis, and most of the ISIS members who raped these ladies the ladies have been concubines, and as a result of rape, a number of children have been born. These children, this issue is very important. We are talking about these children from 2014 until today, in 2022, these children were born, and until now, they don't have any national identity, they don't have any nationality. And this is a very big problem, and this is a big concern. And these mothers, they don't have lineage. The mothers do not have the right to find a lineage for these children, to name them after their fathers, because they don't know their fathers. We in Iraq, we have drafted legislation that a mother can have a nationality for her children who are born of a foreign father. But before the nationality, there should be marital contract. If the mother doesn't have any marital contract, then it becomes very difficult for the mother to have identity for the children. So every child who is born in wedlock, out of wedlock, and even the father is not known, this child is supposed to be Muslim. And after ISIS, the big problem that we have now is that these Yazidi ladies who are not Muslims, and they cannot accept their children to be Muslim. The Yazidis have accepted these women to return back to them. Most of them were raped and they have children. So they accepted the mothers, but they didn't accept their children. So I'm a woman, and I know what the situation of a mother who has been raped and gave children, and that child does not have the right to come and live with society. There is one lady who said that I got a child whose father is from ISIS. This the popular forces took over the places which were occupied by ISIS, and they asked the lady, has this child been born before ISIS was here or before? And she said, if this child is born during the time of ISIS, then it becomes very difficult for me. So now this lady is supposed to go back to her country in order to have identity of her child.
يسأل على هذا الطفل، هذا صعب. احنا مجموعة هذا الوقت، أنا كانت نائبة، فكرنا شلون نقدر نساعد هذه الأطفال، لأنه دولة العراق حسب إحصائية من قبل رئيس الوزراء
the cabinet minister.
6,000 أطفال اتولدوا من الدواعش من الأم العراقي. أنا حاليا ما أقول 6,000، أنا أقول إذا كان 1000 طفل، ما أقول إذا 1000، إذا 100 طفل، 100 طفل إذا بدون هوية بدون شلون الدولة لازم تتعامل ويا هذه الأطفال؟ وكانت صعبة جدا حتى ويا UN. أول اجتماعنا ويا ب 2000 وتقريبا 15-16 ويا كل السفراء من الاتحاد الأوروبي والسفير الأمريكي بهذا الوقت، طلبنا هذه الأطفال يتولدوا وهسه موجودين بالعراق حتى مكانهم مبين. يعني إذا كان أنا أقول شيء يمكن أنتم ما عندكم تصديق لهذه الفكرة. هذه الأطفال يعني حتى مع طبعا هذه الأطفال لحد الآن ما عندهم
until today they don't have a certain place.
هذا الأطفال
these children are in the prison. They are living in the prison. What humanity can stand this? Children have no any mistake, have any sin.
محكومين بالدواعش، أمهاتهم بس بالآخر أطفال وياهم.
sentenced to prison.
يعني ولد بمكان والله العظيم إنسان ما يتحمل
in a place
هذا المكان
احتراما
مو إنسان يقدر يعيش بهذا المكان. هذا يتعامل.
A human being cannot live in these places where these children were born.
أمهاتهم عراقيات حتى إذا كان أمهاتهم المهم طفل موجودة بهذه.
Even if their mothers were foreigners, they do not deserve living in such a miserable place. You got UN, UNHCR, UNICEF, they know.
ولحد هذه اللحظة ما بها أي حلول لهم. كلنا نحكي على تهيئة الطفل مرة أخرى إلى المجتمع. كلنا نحكي هذه الأطفال لازم
voice of these
بعض
children
الأطفال
to the
رجعوا إلى
international
بلدنا.
community. Some of the children return back to our country and
أما على
5 years
تدريبات
old, and these children
بدون هوية، بدون أي تهيؤ للعيشة الكريمة، بدون إنه حتى
and in the hand of ISIS.
دراسة ولا
So they don't have any kind of schooling. They don't go to school. They don't have anything. So the whole country actually ignore this side.
Hi, Rizan.
Is my time over?
Yes, I'm sorry. This is really interesting. And I want to thank you so much for sharing. And I think you really hit the nail on the head that these children are being, in a sense, criminalized, and really they should be treated as victims, and preserving and protecting, ensuring that their right to identity is ultimately protected is really of critical importance. And thank you so much for the work that you are doing in that regard. I would like to now turn to our final contributor in this session, who is CRC committee member Ann Skelton. She is unfortunately unable to be here with us today because of a prior engagement, but she has kindly shared a video presentation, and she will be talking about some of the situations that the committee has had to grapple with respect to this issue of children affected by armed conflict. And so I'm going to invite my colleagues to play her video now, and then we will come together again afterwards. Thank you.
The issue of identity came up for the Committee on the Rights of the Child in a very direct way in one of its communications that it received under the optional protocol on a communications procedure. Just to briefly explain, this is a complaints procedure which allows individuals, groups of individuals, to bring cases to the committee and to ask for a finding of violations and to ask for redress. Now, in this case, the complainants or the authors of this communication were the grandparents of children of foreign fighters. The mothers and the children were in camps in northern Syria. Indeed, some of them still are there. And the grandparents of the children were living in France and had requested the French government to bring the children back so that they could be looked after by the grandparents. Now, France was the respondent in the case, and they said that the first complaint that they rejected, the first part of this complaint that they rejected, was the idea that the grandparents could bring this case on behalf of the children, because usually these complaints cannot be brought anonymously. So there needs to be a real person bringing the case, and if the case is brought on behalf of a child, that should be with the child's consent. Now, that of course also depends on whether the child is old enough to consent. Here in this case, some were, but most were very young. But another issue was whether or not someone could consent on their behalf, because they are actually living with their mothers. And so in a sense, the French government argued, no one else can make decisions on behalf of the children other than their guardians, and their guardians are not able to do that because we couldn't get into contact with them. Even the grandparents had only intermittent contact. So the committee had to decide whether this lack of clear identity of the children, clear consent by the children. Some of the children had been born in the camps, so their birth dates were not precisely known, their names were not precisely known, but we knew they were there, and their grandparents were pretty clear on the number of children and who their mothers were. And so we decided that we would allow this communication, even though it was sort of partially, let's say, not anonymous, but with gaps in the identity information. And it was important for us to do that because it was such a serious case that it would have been a tragedy for it to falter just on the first point of anonymity and identity. So having then decided that, the committee decided again that the case was admissible, And why there was a question mark over this is because France said, these children do not belong within our jurisdiction. Our jurisdiction is France. And the way that human rights generally works is countries are responsible for the people, including the children, within their territorial jurisdiction, and not necessarily for the rights of their citizens once their citizens go abroad. However, states are always able to advance consular services on behalf of their citizens in other countries. So the committee decided in the end that France did have jurisdiction over these children. In other words, they were able to act on their behalf using consular service. And given the dire circumstances that the children were living in the camps, very dangerous conditions for their health, they were lacking education, they were lacking health services, many children have died in these camps. It obviously was a very unusual set of circumstances. And in that case, we felt that France's ability to help the children translated into an obligation to help them, because if they didn't help them, their right to life, survival, and development was immediately placed at risk, together with a number of other rights that were at risk as well. Now, in some of the scholarship, some of the criticisms and comments that have come out about this case, one line of criticism is that the committee should not have based their decision on nationality, because that might be too narrow. So in another case, one might want to argue that children need assistance even if they're not the citizens of a particular country. And I understand that. But on the other hand, I think it was important in this case that the nationality created a link between France and the children. And it wasn't the basis on which we made the finding. It was one of the factors put all together that made it possible for France to act on behalf of the children, and therefore, according to the committee, necessary for France to act on behalf. And then in the end, the committee found the case admissible and found that France had violated the rights of the children and called on France to make all good faith efforts to bring those children back to France. So I think this is also, looking at identity and citizenship linked together. This is rather an interesting case that brings those issues to the fore and shows how in very practical ways the committee, under its communications procedure, is having to grapple with identity issues.
So although Anne isn't here with us today, I'd just like to really thank her for that really interesting contribution. At this stage, I would like to invite all of the panelists to put their cameras on. I know that we've gone over time a little bit. I think it was a really dynamic discussion. And so as opposed to asking you all multiple questions, I'm just going to end this session by asking you each the same question in the interest of time. And so I'm going to start with you, Dragika. And I'd like to ask you, if you could speak to any recent positive developments that you've identified in your respective, for all of you in your respective areas of work. Can you share your thoughts on what more states and civil society, and also those with lived experience, can do to ensure that these developments continue to progress?
Indeed, it has been really interesting to listen to colleagues, and Colombia and Iraq are both on the children and conflict agenda. So really, really great to hear those perspectives. We are particularly concerned about the situation in Iraq with a lack of birth registration for children that Rezan has spoken about. And one of the key tools of our mandate is to dialogue with parties who are committing these violations. And once they're designated in the Secretary General's annual report, for those of you who don't know our agenda, we have the mandate to talk to them about basically a range of actions that are time-bound that will enable preventing and ending these grave violations. And one of the things that we talk about is legislation. I'm really glad that Mikiko in her welcoming remarks mentioned our press release that we jointly published in September on purpose, just out of the third committee session, because the group of us who came together to reinforce the age of a child per CRC is under 18 is because we are observing that member states are looking for loopholes. One of the cases we're working on right now is a difficult one with Afghanistan. It's particularly that group of children between 15 and 18 that we worry about in contexts such as countering violent extremism and in dealings with certain groups. So just wanted to say that. And with that in mind, the partnership and coordination with other special rapporteurs and other UN agencies and bodies for us is critical to keep reminding member states of their commitments, of the range of human rights that need to be upheld under the convention, regardless of children's age, gender, status, country of origin, location. And their obviously right to identity and birth registration. And with that, I wanted to also mention OPAC because colleagues from Colombia spoke extensively about reintegration. I'm sorry to the translators for speaking so quickly. We really need to, reinforce that the 172 countries that have committed in ratifying this instrument need to implement it, and those who haven't signed or ratified need to as well. Children have a right to, once released from having been recruited and used, receive long-term sustainable gender and age-sensitive disability inclusive reintegration programs, and none of these services are available to them, are possible without their, a right to nationality and legal identity. So anyone who can echo those messages with us is really valuable. And on the point of counterterrorism, because it keeps coming up, our sort of core message is to remind member states to refrain from rendering individuals, notably children, stateless. Their right to nationality is enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the CRC, and numerous other treaties, not to mention, and that safeguards and processes that protect people from becoming stateless must be put in place. So I'm hopeful about the initiative that at least we have around action plans, and now emergingly, so prevention plans to really try to discuss what is needed to put these roadblocks in place so that we don't have the issue come up so much, at least in the remit of our agenda. But there's a lot more scope and room for us to think this through the CAC agenda lens.
Yeah.
Back to you.
Thank you so much, Trajika. And Stella Rizan, would you like to offer a short answer on where you see progress and what more should be done?
Sí, yo quisiera.
Yes, I would like to say that the most positive that I see, and I believe that helps to solve this situation, is related to the strength of the young and male and female that came out of armed conflict. Something happens in Colombia that Ferley commented. Young men who have their projects, other people who had the opportunity that share with us in Taller de Vida, like Ferley, Gina, Marieliana, and many others, how did they survive the armed conflict and today are citizens of a country that admits them and recognizes them? They have their own projects, they have their own proposals to help and assist all the young and children that have gone through the conflict. And that is an action of courage that the international organizations and cooperation organizations should support and accompany. And I want to make a call. We are also an organization of the family and child. We must invite other organizations to look at this movement that come from survivors of these processes. In Colombia, for instance, we listen to the voices of these young people. The second thing is to strengthen our organizations. I would say to my colleague telling us the situation in Iraq, I would advise her. In Colombia, we also have lived having children from the war and from raping. We need to be strong as organizations to continue in these processes, to open the possibilities of dialogue, to facilitate a change where these children can be admitted and incorporated in society.
Thank you so much, Stella. I'm going to give the final word to Rizan, and then we will wrap up this session. Thank you.
طبعا أشكركم.
I thank you very much. Unfortunately, some of I missed some in translation because of network. These children, not only in Iraq, all children all over the world, those who are responsible for these children, whether in our country, Iraq, or in other country, these children are the children of the world. We have to work on them, all the world. We have to work on them. We have to make sure that these children, my mother's name, this campaign, this is the identity. My name means I'm existent. I'm Iraqi. Our problem inside our country, even our nationality law, these children must be Muslim. In the country, we have Christians, we have Yazidis. These mothers, they have the right and pursuant to law that every child must be Muslim and be named after the father. Even if he doesn't have a father, must be named to an anonymous father. Our work as NGOs and civil society organizations, we have to work on changing this law so that the child must be named after the mother, not the father, non-existing father. So we in the country, our laws are depicted from the Sharia, but we have experienced a lot of problems. We have to change our laws, and this law cannot be changed by internal NGOs and civil society organizations, and it requires international support, your support, because these children tomorrow, or even tomorrow, I mean, these children are being indoctrinated with ISIS doctrine. So what belonging do these children have to this state, to humanity? So I appeal to all of you, please help us. We might have gone through these problems, and you have seen many problems that have been solved. Now, through UN, through embassies, they have to emphasize on children before the mother. The mothers are already victims, but why should children be victimized? They need identity, they need services so as to live like any child. At the moment, a child law is under discussion in the Iraqi parliament, and we need to support so that we can protect children. Every child must have identity, so that you can be able, for us to have this law, we need support, your support. I thank you very much for availing the opportunity for me.
Thank you so much, Rizan. And I would like to thank all of the panelists.
Yo quisiera decirle a Rizan que estemos aquí todos unidos y estés hablando.
I would like to say that for us it's a great step. It's a great step that you are able to share with us. We have done this step to advance towards these laws.
I mean, I would just really like to thank all of you on this panel. I think it has been extremely engaging and just really such a dynamic group of people coming together from different aspects and different backgrounds to talk through this issue. And I just really want to thank you so much for being here. And thank you so much, Furley, for sharing your story, which has really inspired so many people. I could already tell from the conversations that we're seeing. I want to hand over to Mia. I'm going to close the session here, and Mia has a few words for you, and then we will start again in a few minutes.
Okay, thanks everybody. Thank you for that excellent panel. I really, really was inspired and challenged about the different work that you're doing. Now we will have another intermission. Again, we will have some drawings from Ukraine. This time they will be focusing on what happens to children when they're separated from their families. But we'd like to end on some hope that these children have in their last drawings of what they see as their future. It is a bright future. It is one without war. It is one where they're together with their families, and it is one with peace. Without further ado, we'll have a 5-minute break, and then we'll start again the last session for today. Thank you, everybody.